My life had always been a precise calculus of lines and contours, a quiet devotion to the truth etched onto parchment. I was a cartographer, not of the satellite-fed present, but of the whispering past. My days unfolded within the hushed sanctity of my studio, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten territories, their boundaries re-established through my steady hand. Each pen stroke was a meditation, each archival dust mote a silent witness to my relentless pursuit of accuracy. The world, for me, was a vast, intricate puzzle, and I, its patient solver. Then came the summons, a crisp, official envelope that sliced through the ordered serenity of my existence. It spoke of an ancestral estate, a remote property I barely knew existed, tucked away on a forgotten stretch of coastline, now mine by the decree of a distant relative's passing. The news arrived not as a liberation, but as a disruption, an unwelcome jagged edge in my otherwise smooth chronology. Duty, however, was as ingrained in me as the ink stains on my fingertips. The journey was a slow descent into remoteness. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to tracks barely discernible beneath encroaching weeds. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and decay, a primal breath that seemed to predate human memory. When I finally saw it, silhouetted against a bruised twilight sky, the estate was less a house and more a monument to entropy. Gables sagged like weary shoulders, windows stared out like vacant eyes, and ivy, thick as a strangler's vine, throttled the crumbling stone. It was vast, imposing, and utterly silent. The caretaker, a wiry, taciturn local whose face was a roadmap of weathered lines, had left a key beneath a loose flagstone, along with a terse note advising me to check the main study. I pushed open the heavy oak door, the groan of hinges echoing through the cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was cold, heavy with the scent of mildewed paper and something else, a faint, earthy aroma, like disturbed soil or ancient wood rot. I moved through the echoing chambers, a stranger in my own inheritance, until I found the study. It was a grand room, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of books, their spines cracked and faded. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, a fine, gray snow that shimmered in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. At the center, a massive oak desk stood like an altar, its surface scarred by generations of use. My gaze, accustomed to seeking order amidst chaos, immediately fell upon a rolled parchment lying partially unfurled amidst a stack of yellowed ledgers. It was thicker than most, its edges brittle, the paper itself possessing a strange, almost leathery texture. I approached it with the reverence I reserved for all ancient documents, my fingers tracing the faint, irregular grain. With a soft sigh, I unrolled it completely. It was a map, unmistakably, of the estate and its immediate surroundings. But this was no ordinary survey. My breath hitched. The draftsmanship was exquisite, a masterwork of delicate lines and meticulous shading, far surpassing anything I had ever seen from that era. Every gnarled tree, every undulating contour of the land, every minute variation in the coastline was rendered with obsessive detail. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the aged paper, inhaling its peculiar, musky scent. The ink, a deep, rich sepia, seemed to possess an unnatural vibrancy, as if it had been laid down only yesterday. But then, the anomalies began to prickle at my professional sensibilities. There were symbols I did not recognize, cryptic glyphs scrawled beside familiar landmarks, the old well, the decaying boathouse, a cluster of ancient standing stones near the property's western edge. They were not standard cartographic notations, they were more akin to pictograms, stylized and unnerving, like a language trying to speak without words. Some depicted what looked like coiled serpents, others, a series of concentric circles that pulsed with an implied, unsettling energy. and then there was the incompleteness. Vast swaths of the map, particularly towards the ocean shore, simply ceased. It wasn't merely unfinished, it was as if the artist had reached a boundary, a line beyond which no detail could be rendered, or perhaps, was allowed to be rendered. My cartographer's mind, trained to seek resolution and clarity, recoiled. Why such precision in one area, such an abrupt, almost violent absence in another? This wasn't the work of a distracted hand, it felt deliberate, a secret held in the very fabric of its design. My gaze drifted to the window, beyond the skeletal trees, and out towards the vast expanse of the sea. The map's blankness felt connected to that immense, unknowable presence. The map was an enigma, a challenge to my expertise, but also something more. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I smoothed the ancient document. A determined curiosity, sharp as a freshly honed pen nib, began to stir within me, overriding the unease. I would complete this map. I would understand its unsettling truths. But as I stared at the blank spaces, a faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the parchment, a low thrum that spoke of something ancient and hungry, waiting beneath the soil. The ink-dark lines of the inherited map, so precise on the aged vellum, pulled me towards the encroaching wilderness beyond the manor's immediate grounds. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of compass and ruling pen, now traced the imagined paths over crumbling stone and tenacious vine. This was not the orderly world of archives, but a landscape demanding to be understood, its truths obscured by centuries of neglect. A cartographer's task, yes, but one imbued with a peculiar, unsettling gravity. My boots crunched on gravel path long reclaimed by moss, then sank into the soft loam of the untamed woods. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, held a peculiar stillness. The estate unfurled before me, a vast, forgotten tapestry. Modern deeds made no mention of it, a void that prickled my professional sensibilities. A raised mound, certainly, covered in a thick pelt of weeds and tangled roots, but no discernible architecture. Yet, the map's lines were unequivocal, depicting a rectangular footprint, a roofline. I knelt, scraping away the topsoil with a trowel I'd brought, feeling for the resistance of stone. There was none, only packed earth and the sinuous grip of roots. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the structure whole, leaving only a ghost on the parchment. They clung to the undersides of the ancient oaks, pulled at the base of the gnarled cedars, and stretched like grasping tendrils across the forest floor. These were not mere absences of light, they felt substantial, weighted, as if they possessed an internal depth that swallowed the last vestiges of the day. My hand instinctively tightened on the rolled map. They were rough-hewn, devoid of any discernible carving or inscription, yet their placement was anything but random. They stood in an irregular pattern, forming no obvious boundary or path, simply there, silent sentinels. Each stone was roughly the height of my knee, their surfaces pitted and scarred by millennia of weather, coated in a fine, almost velvety layer of moss. Nothing. Yet, their presence was insistent, a silent question posed to an empty forest. They were not on my inherited map, nor could I imagine any practical function they might serve. They simply existed, a stark, unsettling punctuation mark in the wild growth. A sudden, profound drop in temperature enveloped me, a pocket of Arctic air in the otherwise mild evening. It was like walking into an invisible wall of ice. My mind, trained in logic and verifiable facts, struggled to categorize this anomaly. The air itself felt thin, brittle. Then, a sound. Not the rustle of leaves, nor the call of a bird, nor the distant drone of an insect. It was a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. It was almost imperceptible, a frequency felt. More than heard, resonating faintly in my bones. My cartographer's tools, usually a comfort, felt suddenly inadequate. The methodical certainty that usually grounded me had begun to fray at the edges. The estate was not merely old, it was ancient, and actively resistant to being known. The moon, a sliver of silver, cast a weak, tremulous light across the water. The air here was sharp with salt and brine, a clean, cutting scent that momentarily cleared the lingering mustiness from my mind. But even here, the world seemed askew. The waves, usually a ceaseless rhythm of advance and retreat, lay almost perfectly still. They were present, distinct lines of foam and dark water, but they did not break, did not surge. They simply were, frozen in a perpetual moment of arrival, their white caps stark against the black expanse of the sea. It was beautiful, in a way, this arrested motion, but profoundly unsettling. The world, it seemed, had forgotten its own physics, or perhaps, was being subtly rewritten. The land, the sea, even the very air, seemed to conspire in a quiet, relentless assault on my understanding. The estate, a sleeping giant draped in verdant ruin, seemed to exhale a silent invitation, a promise of hidden corners and forgotten histories. I felt a singular, almost magnetic draw to its untouched edges, a cartographer's hunger to fill in the blank spaces with verified truth. My initial forays into the overgrown gardens and skeletal groves were marked by a quiet determination. I measured, sketched, and noted, comparing the physical landscape to the antique document clutched in my hand. But as the days bled into one another, a subtle disquiet began to seep into the meticulous rhythm of my work. It started with the shadows. Fleeting, formless blurs that would skitter at the periphery of my vision, just beyond the focal point of my gaze. A quick turn of the head, a sharp blink, and they would dissolve into the dappled light of the afternoon, leaving nothing but the rustle of leaves and the unsettling echo of my own heightened awareness. I rationalized them as tricks of the eye, the play of light through ancient foliage, the inevitable consequence of solitude in a place so deeply steeped in age. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling, the groans of timber and stone adjusting to the ceaseless tug of gravity. But they grew more distinct, though never quite coherent. A soft exhalation, a sibilant hiss like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, or the ghost of a syllable just beyond the threshold of understanding. My logical mind, ever my anchor, suggested drafts, the wind's peculiar song through broken panes, the creak of an old house breathing. The subtlety of the disturbances escalated. Objects in my study, a room I kept meticulously ordered, would subtly shift. A heavy brass paperweight, usually anchoring a stack of survey notes, would be found angled just so, a fraction of an inch from its accustomed place. A specific volume on local folklore, which I had left spine out, would be turned with its worn cover facing the room. Nothing overtly dramatic, nothing that screamed intrusion, but enough to prickle the hairs on my neck, to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. I found myself retracing my steps, mentally cataloging the placement of every item before leaving a room, only to return and find some minute, unsettling alteration. Was I so isolated that I was beginning to conjure these phantom movements? Was the solitude eroding the sharp edges of my mind? My nights were haunted by vivid, unsettling nightmares. I saw the map unfurling, its lines bleeding into the very earth, revealing not landmarks, but veins, capillaries, a living circulatory system beneath the soil. And always, the feeling of being watched, an unseen presence that pressed in from the periphery of the dream, a weight that stole my breath. One evening, driven by a gnawing restlessness that the manor seemed to cultivate, I walked down to the ocean shore at night with stationary waves. It was profoundly unsettling. This absence of expected motion, this quietude in a place that should churn with raw energy. I spun around, my heart lurching, but the shore was empty, the only movement the slow, deliberate turning of the tide far out, beyond the stationary waves. Back in the study, the map lay spread across my drafting table, illuminated by the single, unwavering beam of my lamp. I ran a hand over the aged vellum, tracing the familiar contours of the estate. They were not ink, but seemed etched into the very fibers of the paper, barely visible unless the light caught them at a precise angle. Tiny, swirling glyphs, like ancient script, clustered around the area marked Untamed Woods, a section I had previously dismissed as merely decorative. They were new. I was certain of it. My cartographer's memory, precise and unwavering, swore they had not been there before. These were not lines I had overlooked, nor faded details brought back by handling. These were an addition, an insidious, creeping revelation. It was no longer a static document of the past, it was a living, breathing thing, changing, revealing, demanding. The impulse to complete the missing sections had transformed, subtly at first, into a desperate, gnawing hunger for understanding. This wasn't mere cartography, it felt like an excavation of something buried deep within the earth, and deeper still within my own lineage. The manor's library, a mausoleum of forgotten voices, became my sanctuary and my prison. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of winter light that pierced the grime-coated panes, illuminating the endless spines of leather-bound volumes, each exhaling the scent of aged paper and slow decay. I worked through the nights, fueled by a bitter tea and an escalating anxiety, sifting through generations of forgotten ephemera, ledgers, diaries, letters, legal documents, all brittle and fragile beneath my touch. My initial search was haphazard, a broad sweep for any mention of the land beyond the manor house. Soon, however, a pattern began to emerge, faint as a whisper at first, then growing into a guttural roar. A brittle, leather-bound journal, its pages the color of old bone, chronicled the slow, terrifying descent of an ancestor, a woman named Eleanor. Her elegant script, initially detailing mundane domestic concerns, devolved into frantic, looping scrawls. She wrote of the quiet ones, of shadows that stretched too long, of a deep thrumming from the earth beneath the old standing stones, a landmark clearly delineated on my map's incomplete eastern edge. A terse note from a local constable confirmed his absence, stating only that the magistrate walked into the fogs by the old tidal pools and was not seen again. The tidal pools, I realized with a jolt, corresponded precisely with a cluster of faded X's near the western boundary on my map. A boundary that kissed the very edge of the sea. The map, initially a cartographer's puzzle, began to feel less like a guide and more like a blueprint for malevolence. Each cryptic symbol, each faint, almost erased notation, seemed to echo the desperate pleas and terrifying observations I unearthed. The specific locations marked on the vellum, the standing stones, the tidal pools, a particularly dense copse of ancient, twisted oaks, were not just features of the landscape. They were anchor points, nexus points, for these recurring incidents of madness, disappearance, and uncanny decay. A particularly disturbing discovery was a small, hand-drawn sketch tucked within a collection of parish records. It depicted a grotesque figure, half human, half something else, rising from what appeared to be a swirling vortex of dark water, its limbs too long, its head too small, its eyes like chips of obsidian. Beneath it, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "The tide does not turn for it." The map wasn't just showing me where things were, it was showing me what was there, and perhaps, why. The sight was profoundly unsettling. The waves, caught mid-crest, appeared frozen, their foamy peaks crystalline under the sliver of moon, like glass sculptures held aloft by an unseen hand. It was the great stillness the magistrate had written of, an impossible tableau that defied the very laws of the ocean. It was the deep thrumming Eleanor had described, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a feeling of immense, ancient power. My breath hitched in my throat. The map, I knew then, was not merely a guide to the estate's hidden features. I sat hunched over the drafting table, the lamplight a small, defiant circle against the encroaching gloom of the room. It clung to the vellum, to my fingertips, even to the fabric of my shirt. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching began, like mice behind the wainscoting, but it quickly grew in intensity, moving from the walls to the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't the scurry of rodents, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like claws dragging across rough stone. Then, a sound, distinct and undeniable, emerged from the cacophony, a low, guttural murmur. It was formless, a vibration more than a voice, yet it prickled the hairs on my arms. My hand froze, the graphite pencil hovering above the vellum. I strained my ears, my own breathing suddenly loud in the stillness. Suddenly, the room around me seemed to ripple, the solid oak of the drafting table blurring at the edges. My vision swam, and for a terrifying instant, the dusty study vanished. The water, black as obsidian, stretched endlessly under a sky devoid of stars, yet illuminated by a phosphorescent glow emanating from the water itself. The waves, though frozen in their crests and troughs, seemed to heave with an unseen force, their glassy surfaces reflecting nothing but the eerie light. A profound, crushing loneliness descended upon me, a sense of being utterly abandoned on the edge of an impossible world. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision snapped back, the familiar walls of the study rushing in, leaving me gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my mobile phone. I called a former colleague, a historical archivist who had always found my esoteric pursuits amusing. The phone rang for an eternity, each chime echoing my escalating panic. When he finally answered, his voice was tinny, distant. He listened patiently, then offered a chuckle, light and disbelieving. "Read, old boy, you've been cooped up too long. That old manor playing tricks on your mind. Get some rest, or better yet, come back to civilization for a bit." His words, meant to soothe, only deepened the terrifying chasm of my isolation. He couldn't hear it, couldn't see it. He believed I was just stressed. They were sharper, coalescing into discernible words, though fractured and ancient. "He comes. For what is owed. For lineage." A book of ancient maritime charts, previously closed and resting on a shelf, slid silently off its perch and landed with a soft thud on the rug. My head snapped towards it, but there was nothing there, no draft, no tremor. I stood, backing away from the drafting table, my gaze sweeping the room. I saw it then, a fleeting distortion in the reflection of the windowpane, a tall, gaunt figure, indistinct and shimmering like heat haze, standing just behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the space was empty. Only the dusty lamplight illuminated the empty room. Yet, the scent of earth and metal was now so strong it tasted like dust on my tongue. "Ours. It was a possessive hiss, a claim. I stumbled backward, knocking against a heavy armchair, my legs suddenly weak. My mind screamed for an escape, for any way out of this suffocating enclosure. I had to leave, to drive away. I burst out onto the gravel driveway, the night air a sharp shock against my face. I ran towards my vehicle, a sturdy, albeit aging, estate car. My hand went to the door handle, but it was locked. I had left the keys in the ignition, I was sure of it. Frantically, I patted my pockets, then peered through the window. The keys were gone. Not on the seat, not on the dashboard. They were simply gone. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the ground beneath my feet, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. They were no longer just words but a torrent of intent, of hunger. I was not alone. It was here, with me, and it wanted something. Something terrible. The air in the study, thick with the scent of ancient paper and dust motes dancing in the slender shafts of light, pressed in on me. Days bled into nights, marked only by the guttering of candles and the increasing strain behind my eyes. I ate little, slept less, my every waking thought consumed by the intricate topography unfurling beneath my gaze. There was a section, a sprawling, unmarked expanse near the property's furthest, wildest edge, that haunted me. Unlike the meticulous detail everywhere else, the faint etchings of long-vanished cottages, the precise delineation of forgotten streams, this area was a void, save for a series of concentric, almost imperceptible rings. They weren't contours, not in any cartographic sense I understood. I had dismissed them as an artistic flourish, perhaps a stylistic choice by an ancestor whose skill occasionally veered into the abstract. But the more I studied them, the more a persistent unease began to curdle in my gut. I'd skimmed it before, finding only rambling observations on local flora and fauna, tinged with a growing paranoia. Now, a specific passage snagged my attention, written in a cramped, almost panicked hand, the great stillness beneath. The rings must hold. I returned to the map, placing the journal beside it. I angled the map, tilting it this way and that, searching for what I had missed. And then, it emerged. Not from the ink, but from the very fibers of the vellum itself. Beneath the faint, concentric rings, visible only when the light caught the parchment at a precise angle, was a secondary layer of marks. They were almost like scars, or the impressions left by something pressed hard against the surface from below. It was not drawn, but impressed, as if the very air had been pushed aside to leave its indelible mark. The rings, I now understood with a sickening clarity, were not ripples of water, but echoes of containment. The interlocking symbols were a ward, a lock, a seal. And the featureless expanse? It was not empty. It was a prison. The journal entry throbbed in my mind of the great stillness beneath. This wasn't a hidden treasure. The map, my family's legacy, was not a guide to wealth, but a blueprint of a cage. They painted a picture of something formless, immense. Utterly malevolent, buried deep beneath the very land I now stood upon. My fingers trembled as I traced the etched lines of the seal. They were faint, almost worn away in places, as if the immense pressure from within was slowly, inexorably, grinding them down. The breaking will be the end, the journal had warned. The seal was weakening. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Why me? Why now? My family had been cartographers. We hadn't merely inherited this estate, we had been drawn to it, by some unseen pull woven into our very lineage. Drawn to this place, to this map, to this weakening prison. Was I meant to complete it, to reinforce the failing containment? Or was my presence here, my very act of uncovering these secrets, merely the final, unwitting step in its liberation? I stumbled from the study, the map clutched in a numb hand, the journal tucked beneath my arm. I needed air. I needed distance. The air, usually crisp with salt and movement, was unnaturally still. The tide, which should have been a rhythmic inhale and exhale of the vast water, seemed to hold its breath. The waves, reaching towards the sand, froze at their crests, holding their shape for an unnerving moment before collapsing with a soundless sigh, only to reform, identical, a few yards further out. It was a tableau of arrested motion, a colossal, unblinking eye staring back at me. It was the vast, dreaming hunger my ancestor had written about, stirring in its weakened confinement. I was not merely an inheritor, I was a custodian, or perhaps, a sacrifice. The choice, if there even was one, was mine to make. And the entity beneath the earth was waiting. I angled the map, tilting it to catch the lantern's hesitant light. The parchment, brittle and stained, seemed to absorb the glow rather than reflect it, drawing the eye into its intricate, looping lines. A low thrum began, not in the air, but beneath the floorboards, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. It felt like the land itself was stirring, a vast, sleeping beast stretching in its subterranean lair. The chill in the room intensified, biting at my exposed skin, yet the lantern flame remained steady, mocking the unnatural cold. My breath plumed in faint clouds, each exhalation a visible testament to the encroaching frigidity. Closer. The edge. My gaze snapped to the map again. A section, previously unremarkable, now pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. It depicted the estate's western boundary, where the cliffs plunged into the sea. The thrumming intensified, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated the very glass in the window panes. The current calls. The shore awaits. An irresistible pull began, a subtle magnetic force urging me from the study, down the creaking stairs, and towards the heavy oak front door. My steps were not entirely my own, a strange inertia guiding my limbs, yet my will remained, a small, defiant ember against the encroaching tide of influence. I clutched the journal and the map tighter, their weight a grounding anchor in the rising sea of disorientation. The night air outside was thick with the scent of salt and decay, a pungent blend that clung to my clothes and hair. It was a sight that defied logic, a tableau of frozen motion. Yet, the waves, usually a ceaseless dance of crest and trough, were utterly still. They stood arrested, towering walls of water caught mid-surge, their foamy peaks crystalline and unmoving under the faint moonlight. It was as if time itself had fractured, pinning the ocean in a moment of eternal suspension. The air here was heavy, charged with an almost palpable energy, a profound stillness that was more terrifying than any storm. You stand at the threshold, cartographer of the lost. The entity was here, undeniably present, a vast, unseen intelligence pressing in from all sides. I felt my thoughts begin to fray, my resolve waver under the relentless assault. Your blood. The key. Your lineage. It was trying to consume me, to merge with me, to use my body as a vessel. I fought back, a desperate, internal struggle, clenching my jaw, forcing myself to think, to resist. My grip on the journal tightened until my knuckles were white. A flicker of light, an almost imperceptible shift in the moonlight on the journal's aged cover, caught my eye. I tore my gaze from the horrifying ocean and looked down. The last few pages, previously blank, now bore a faint, glowing script, not ink, but light itself woven into the parchment. It was a ritual, a countermeasure, scrawled in an ancient hand that was both familiar and alien. It detailed a complex series of symbols, mirroring those on the map, that had to be etched into the earth at the precise points of convergence. Not an object. Not a life, not directly. But something far more insidious, more intimate. It demanded a piece of myself, a thread of my lineage, woven into the very earth, to act as an eternal ward. It spoke of severing a connection, of renouncing my heritage to the land, of becoming an outsider, forever unbound from the estate, lest the entity use that bond to break free. It was a sacrifice of belonging, of ancestral right, of identity itself. If I failed, if I succumbed, the entity would not merely haunt this estate. It would break free, unleashed upon the world, an ancient hunger given form, spreading its blight far beyond these shores. Not now. Not ever. The determination, though battered and bruised, flared brighter within me. This wasn't just about my sanity, or even my life. It was about the world beyond these cursed shores. I had unearthed this. Horror, I would be the one to bury it again, no matter the cost. The countermeasure was terrifying, the sacrifice immense, but the alternative was unthinkable. The final act was upon me. The unseen intelligence, a vast and ancient thing, had pressed in until the very air in the study felt solid, a suffocating block around me. Its voice, not of sound but of pure, crushing knowing, had resonated with the forgotten ages it claimed to embody. My terror, though absolute, was no longer paralyzing. It had sharpened into a desperate, cold resolve. There was no turning back, no escape. The map, now a living, malevolent guide, lay splayed on the mahogany, its lines twisting like veins. I understood its final, horrifying instruction. The ritual. The sacrifice. My fingers, trembling but steady, gathered the few items I needed, a tarnished silver compass, its needle now spinning wildly. Uselessly, a small, heavy iron box containing the ancestors' cryptic journal, and a wickedly sharp, ceremonial blade I'd found tucked away in a velvet-lined drawer. Its hilt cool beneath my palm. Each object felt charged, humming with a morbid energy. I would descend. I must. The entrance to the deepest, most corrupted part of the estate was not in the cellar, nor the crypt beneath the chapel. It was hidden behind a false wall in the oldest section of the manor's foundations, revealed only by a faint, almost invisible etching on the ancient stone, a symbol I dismissed as decorative until the map's final revelation. I began my descent, each handhold on the rough-hewn rock face a gamble against oblivion. They spoke of ease, of turning back, of a warm bed in forgotten anxieties. They promised peace, a cessation of the crushing weight that had become my constant companion. I pushed on, my determination a brittle shield against the psychological assault. The shaft opened into a narrow, winding passage. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust blooming on forgotten blood. Then, the floor leveled, and the passage widened dramatically. My lantern beam stretched, revealing a cavern of immense proportions. And then I saw it. It was not water, not truly. It was a geological anomaly, or perhaps a manifestation of the entity's power, frozen in time. The illusion was perfect, terrifying. I could almost hear the roar of the surf, feel the spray, yet all was silent, unnervingly still. My breath hitched. This was the place. They clawed at the edges of my sanity, threatening to unravel the fragile thread of my resolve. Turn back, read. This is madness. You cannot win. Give up. Let it take you. But my eyes, fixated on the stationary waves, saw more than just frozen motion. They were elongated, almost human in their outline, trapped within the immobile depths. Not carvings, but imprints, like bodies pressed into wet cement before it hardened. A horrifying realization bloomed in my mind. These weren't merely geological formations, they were the petrified remnants of something ancient, something that had been swallowed and held in eternal stasis. A sudden, violent tremor shook the cavern. Loose pebbles rained down from the unseen ceiling, clattering against the black sand. The ground beneath my feet felt as if it were trying to swallow me whole, a subtle, sucking sensation that pulled at my boots. The entity was here, enraged, fighting my every step. But seeing those trapped forms, understanding the true nature of this horrific tableau, solidified something within me. This was not just about my estate, or my lineage, it was about ending this ancient horror. Each footfall was heavy, deliberate. The air grew thick with a terrible expectation, the promise of a climax I was utterly unprepared for, yet utterly compelled to meet. The imprints. They were not just vague suggestions now, but clearer, their forms subtly shifting within the glassy, dark surfaces, like bodies suspended in amber. Elongated, almost human, they writhed not with physical motion, but with an internal, silent agony that resonated deep within my own bones. A pressure began to build behind my eyes, a dull ache that quickly intensified to a throbbing vice. It was not a physical pain, but a psychic assault, a crushing weight pressing down on my very consciousness. No. The single word was a defiant spark in the encroaching gloom. I closed my eyes for a fleeting second, gripping the tattered remnants of the map, its aged vellum warm against my palm. The lines, the symbols, the hidden glyphs I had painstakingly uncovered, they were not just historical markers. They were a language, a defense. I forced my eyes open, ignoring the phantom hands that seemed to claw at my vision, blurring the unnatural waves into a swirling vortex of despair. I had seen it, a specific sequence of overlapping sigils, almost hidden in the southernmost corner of the estate's true boundary on the map, at the point where the land met the sea. Not just a border, but a binding. A containment. A ritual. The ancestral cartographer had not just charted the land, he had charted its chains. The sigils were meant to be inscribed upon the threshold, a final, desperate measure against what slept beneath. And this terrifying, frozen expanse of water, this was the threshold. The sand, coarse and damp beneath my boots, was my canvas. I knelt, the pressure in my head intensifying until I tasted coppery blood at the back of my throat. Become one with the quiet. Your lineage demands it. I ignored them, focusing every ounce of my will on the precise angles, the specific curves, the exact overlap of the sigils. My hand shook, but I forced it steady, digging the stylus into the wet sand. As the silver tip moved, a faint luminescence, an ethereal blue, sparked in the sand, tracing the path I laid. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen resistance, as if the very atmosphere pushed back against my efforts. The stationary waves seemed to surge then, not with water, but with a palpable sense of anger, a silent roar that vibrated through the earth and up into my chest. The imprints within them twisted, their forms contorting in what looked like desperate agony, as if the ritual itself was tearing at their essence. My vision swam, the shore blurring, the sigils on the sand becoming indistinct. Focus. The word screamed in my mind, a desperate anchor. I dug deeper, the stylus scraping against grit, my knuckles white. The second sigil, a mirroring arc, intersected the first, and the blue light intensified, pulsing with a slow, deliberate beat. My nose began to bleed, a warm trickle against my numb lips, but I barely registered it. This was not just a drawing, it was an act of will, a confrontation across eons. The final sigil, a central point, a binding knot, was the most difficult. The ground beneath me trembled, a low, resonant hum rising from the depths. The imprints in the glassy waves thrashed violently, their silent agony now a tangible despair, a final, futile struggle against the unseen bonds I was forging. Then, as the last line connected, completing the intricate pattern, a blinding flash of the ethereal blue light erupted from the sand. It pulsed outwards, a silent shockwave that rippled across the stationary waves. The wails ceased. My limbs trembled uncontrollably, and my breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The metallic taste of blood was strong in my mouth. I tried to push myself up, but my muscles screamed in protest. My gaze fell upon my hands, once so steady, so precise. The entity was contained, banished from the immediate surface, bound by the ancient cartographer's wisdom and my own desperate act, but the cost. I had one, yes. But I was no longer whole. My hand, still poised in the air, trembled violently, an echo of the seismic tremors that had just racked my soul. The final line, the last intricate loop of the binding sigil, was etched into the earth. And then, a silence descended, profound and absolute, unlike any I had ever known. Above me, the sky was a vast, bruised canvas, the moon a sliver of bone, offering little solace. The waves, which moments before had crashed with a furious roar, now merely exhaled against the distant horizon, their crests unnaturally still, as if caught in a perpetual, silent pause. Every muscle in my body screamed, a cacophony of protest against the stillness. My limbs felt like leaden weights, and a raw, burning ache pulsed behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, slowly, painfully, my joints grating like ungreased hinges. The salt tang of the air, usually invigorating, now tasted metallic, like old blood. My tongue felt thick, papery. I coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shatter the pervasive quiet, and a sharp pain flared in my chest. My gaze drifted down to my hands, the instruments of my recent torment and, perhaps, salvation. My fingers, once so precise, were now swollen and abraded, the skin torn in places. But it was not merely the superficial damage that held my attention. Across my forearms, stretching up to my shoulders, were faint, silvery lines, almost imperceptible in the dim light, mirroring the pattern of the sigils I had just drawn. The entity was gone. I knew it with an absolute, terrifying certainty. The cost, however, felt infinite. I remembered only the absolute, undeniable will that had guided my hand, a will that felt both my own and profoundly alien. Turning my back to the unnaturally still ocean, I began the arduous trek back towards the looming silhouette of the estate. The sand gave way to uneven shingle, then to a broken path choked with gnarled roots. Each step was an effort, a conscious decision to lift and place my foot, to propel my broken body forward. As I cleared the last rise, the full extent of the devastation unfolded before me. The ancestral home, once a bastion of stoic decay, was now a skeletal ruin. The east wing, where my study had been, was a gaping maw of splintered timbers and shattered glass, its roof caved in like a collapsed lung. The stone walls, thick and ancient, were cracked and fissured, revealing the gray-white mortar beneath. Dust, fine and ancient, billowed softly in the faint breeze, clinging to everything like a shroud. The grand oak that had stood sentinel by the gatehouse was split down its trunk, its mighty branches splayed like the limbs of a broken marionette. I walked through the wreckage, a ghost in my own ruined house. In the shattered remains of the great hall, moonlight streamed through a gaping hole in the ceiling, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. It offered no comfort, no power, only an unsettling clarity, a glimpse into the raw, indifferent mechanisms of the world. I saw patterns in the shattered glass that were not merely random. I heard harmonies in the groaning wood that were not merely structural stress. The world had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. The world beyond this ruined shore, beyond this desecrated estate, would never know. And I, irrevocably changed, scarred in ways no map could ever chart, was left to carry the terrible burden of that knowing, alone under the indifferent gaze of the stationary waves. The final line, the last intricate loop of the bind, was complete. The sand, cool beneath my bare feet, felt like 1,000 tiny needles, each one a testament to the raw nerve endings that now constituted my being. There was no crash, no roar, only a profound, unnatural stillness, as if the very ocean held its breath, deferring to the new, fragile order I had imposed. A chilling silence had descended, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping world, but a vacuum, an absence that vibrated with the memory of a scream. My gaze fell to the intricate map, now etched not just on parchment, but into the very fabric of the land, into my own flesh. The silver stylus had been the conduit, my will the current, and the earth, a vast, living canvas. The entity, the nameless hunger beneath the soil, was contained. It was a victory, I knew, a desperate, costly triumph. But what had I become in the process? The subsequent days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and a strange, almost manic clarity. I left the estate, it's decaying. Grandeur now a monument to a secret only I carried. The old caretaker, a man whose eyes held a weary wisdom, merely nodded when I spoke of departure, his gaze lingering on me with an unsettling understanding. He said nothing, asked nothing, but his silence was a heavy thing, imbued with a knowledge I couldn't quite decipher. My studio, once a sanctuary of order and quiet contemplation, now felt sterile, almost alien. They were superficial, two-dimensional, utterly devoid of the profound, living energies I now knew existed beneath every surface. My hand, the one that had guided the silver stylus, often twitched involuntarily, an itch beneath the skin that no scratching could soothe. I tried to draw, but the lines that emerged were not of ancient cities or forgotten trade routes. They were jagged, arcane symbols, intricate weaves that spoke of containment and warding, shapes that my mind conjured without conscious thought, as if my very being had been recalibrated. Sleep offered little respite. The dreams were not of the entity itself, for that presence was now a contained, muted hum in the furthest reaches of my perception. I saw the earth as a living, breathing skin, and beneath it, a pulsing, captive heart. I would trace patterns in the dust with my finger, patterns I didn't consciously create, but which felt profoundly right star. It was not the entity's direct voice, but a lingering resonance, a shadow of its influence that had imprinted itself upon my soul. Conversations with a former colleague, a meticulous researcher of old maps, became strained. He would speak of new archaeological finds, of exciting cartographic theories, and I would nod, a detached observer. My mind would drift, seeing not the elegant lines of an ancient Roman road, but the unseen network of protections, the bindings that held the very ground together. He spoke of stress and burnout, but I knew the truth. I was not burned out, I was fundamentally rewired. The victory, I understood now, was not an ending. It was a beginning, a terrible genesis. The entity was bound, its hunger caged, but the knowledge of its existence, the memory of its power, had become inextricably woven into my own being. I was the keeper of its prison, and in a way, its constant, unwitting witness. The horror was contained, yes, but it was contained within me, a silent hum beneath the surface of my own skin, a constant reminder of the price paid, and the unending vigil that now defined my existence. The stationary waves of the ocean, forever unmoving, were a perfect metaphor for my new life, eternally still, yet forever holding the potential for an unseen, unfathomable depth.